So let's just jump right in. I mean, just as a general statement of the issue, what we're seeing is several things going on that you have talked about. You guys have written about it extensively. First, the population explosion and the food demand explosion around the world. The UN anticipates that it'll be 70% increase in food demand by 2050. The other, of course, having to do with climate change directly is the impact of climate change on the availability of arable land and water in particular, and how that sets up a clash in terms of food production. You have a 70% increase in food demand and the likely decline in arable land and water to produce food. And so in that context, which has to do with climate change and the need to build a resilient food supply or food production around the world, what's your take on this, and how do you see your company and just the industry in general, the indoor vertical farming industry in general, or your role in particular as one of the leaders moving forward?
Yeah, and great to be with you today, Alex, and share our thoughts, share our story, and ideas for where the industry, farming, food in general need to go. You were just talking about some of these macro trends, and they're very intimidating. They're very impressive in the sense of like how it impresses on us, like how do we get over this? How do we accomplish what we need to feed humanity? And to a certain extent, there's it hopefully gives humanity a punch in the nose that we have to be fierce, we have to be open-minded. Fierce meaning we have to go fast, open-minded meaning we have to think outside of the box of where the solutions could come. And vertical farming is not necessarily the solution that solves the world's problems, but it's illustrative of where technology could be applied to solve an industry or challenges that the world has, that an industry has to scale. So here, when we grow the way we know we could grow using zero soil, we could grow using 95% less water, we could grow using zero pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and we could have tremendous productivity in a very small footprint. So AeroFarms, if we were growing food, similar food as we do now in New York State, our productivity would be about 390 times higher than a field farmer. Meaning what AeroFarms could grow in 1 acre, it would otherwise take 390 acres to grow that same amount of food. This is extremely exciting, and again, it's illustrative of technology used to solve a problem. So here, whether it's light emitting diodes and LEDs, whether it's automation, whether it's machine learning, it's like, how do we understand what a plant wants and how do we give a plant what it wants using other means, meaning not absorbing nutrients and micronutrients from the soil, not absorbing sunlight, but absorbing nutrients and micronutrients that in AeroFarms' case is misted to the root structure, held by a cloth instead of soil that holds the roots and holds the seed, and delivering spectrum at certain intensities, certain frequencies through light emitting diodes. And again, the economics today, for example, might work in leafy greens. They may not work for cash crops like corn, wheat, rice, soy. And what's illustrative is how we could solve a problem in one area and use technology, being open-minded to how a problem solved, and then using that same spirit of innovation of problem solving, out of the box problem solving to solve broader agriculture and food solutions. So we are happy to illustrate a solution and hopefully be a catalyst of more innovation in an industry where there's been underinvestment and under-resourced in terms of step innovations for a long period of time. And what's exciting is now there's awareness that as an industry, this industry is not going anywhere. In fact, the problems are getting bigger, and there are a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of opportunities in which to address.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that brings us to the challenge of scale, of course, and again, you speak about the need to solve these long-term challenges, and that requires just a real fast scaling of your solutions. Tell us a little bit about that in terms of since the challenge is one of really significant, unprecedented scale that the world needs for you to have, be in as many cities as fast as possible. How do you get that done?
So it's tough. This is a tough business. And what makes it tough is there's a lot of technology, a lot of investment in a farm, in an industry that typically has very low margins. This isn't the software industry, it's the farming industry. So it's not enough to produce a plant. We have to produce a plant and sell it where the economics are at the similar state of what the market is used to paying. And the market is very efficient. Like field farming has been around for a long time. It's mature. The costs are really like been attacked from a number of ways to be very efficient and effective. So for us to be successful, we have to be as efficient, as effective as the field farmer as it sells into the value chain. So at a part of local food production, and vertical farming enables local food production, we disintermediate some of the supply chain, some of the trucking, and that helps the economics. But ultimately, it's all part of the calculus for the customer. We have to sell at a certain price to the supermarket to sell to a certain price to the customer. And the economies of scale matter, and it's the evolution of technology matters. And when I say it's a hard industry, we have to figure out what a plant wants outside, reproduce it inside, but then also think about how that interacts with big farms. So we've just built our 9th farm, not just like over a year ago, we opened and started selling product from our 9th farm. And that farm is very different from our 8th farm, is very different from our 7th farm. And that evolution of design, our 9th one is what we call our 4th model of design. We now have a team working on our 5th model of design and our 6th model of design with a lens of how do you reduce the capital cost of the farm? How do you reduce the operational cost of the farm? How do you improve quality? Our ability to be successful on those 3 levels enables us to scale, to grow our 10th farm, our 11th farm, our 12th farm that are in the pipeline, having like financial closes and shovels in the ground 2018. And the business model could be different in different markets. And when I say business model, what I mean is 2 things. One is the cost structure could be different. Like one of the elements of cost is energy. Energy is more abundant in some areas, less abundant in others, and the costs can vary in different markets. Another element is price. Some people might pay higher for quality, some people may not. Some communities might be used to eating leafy greens, and everyone eats, let's say, 20 pounds a year. Some communities, people eat 5 pounds a year, or whatever those numbers are. So the demand's higher or less, the communities are higher and less, and all of that influences the business model. So today, for the most part, if people eat salads, if people appreciate quality, to pay a slight premium to quality. For example, in the US, people pay on average a 20% premium for organic quality food. And that's sums up about the premium that we need to make money. Then there's probably a business model that works. If people are in a community, in a part of the world where they're used to, for example, cooking leafy greens because of a history of dysentery, when you cook leafy greens, you usually buy a lower quality leaf. Then the business model may not work, just the community isn't used to having a better quality product. So this is all to say, like, the business model works in some areas, but what we're proud of is we've accomplished a level of performance that informs the debt. So there's a capital expense to building a farm. If we could not just put our own cash in, but get debt from a bank, similar to when you buy a house, you don't want to put all the cash, you want to get debt. If we could do that, then it allows us to scale faster. And we've gotten debt from like Goldman Sachs and Prudential, which illustrates a level of performance at AeroFarms that I don't think anyone else in the industry has reached. And the industry is going to mature and other people are going to reach this level of performance, but it's kind of a feather in our cap of a certain number of proof points, we're going to have more proof points that are enable us to scale in more and more markets.
Sure, sure. Now, you're going over very well the variables that you primarily control in your own business model, your own business plan, your own execution. There are others that we see in the industry that need to mature as well. Like, for example, I guess we can call it the indoor farming infrastructure. Financing, you mentioned financing. You've been successful getting some rounds of your own. Insurance, I mean, I'd like you to address some of the issues that you see with your insurance carriers. Energy is the big obstacle in indoor farming versus land farming. Again, it's part of the ongoing maturity of the industry and of the model to have these external influences and how you see them evolving. Real estate, for example, you need to go in and find suitable large warehouse industrial properties and near population centers. And so how do you see those kind of external infrastructural industry conditions moving forward as you try to implement your model from city to city?
A few things regarding the industry of vertical farming. Not unlike other industries, there's a couple leaders in the space, like AeroFarms is a leader in the space, and there's a lot of excitement for what a player is doing, a leader's doing, and then other people come into a space. And that's good. Competition improves quality of performance and so forth. This, not unlike other industries, what I expect to happen is there to be an excitement of the industry, a lot of rush in of people coming into the industry, a lot of realization that this is hard and it takes a lot to succeed, and a lot of failures. I personally think probably 80–90% of the people that are entering the vertical farming space are going to go bankrupt in the next 3 to 5 years. And you're seeing bankruptcies all over because, again, people underappreciate the complexity to succeed and also the complexity to scale. Having built 9 farms, just the difference between a small farm and a big farm is huge. The unintuitive problems to solve are very real and very big. So we have 130 people, not because I liked all these people, which I do, but we have a lot of problems to solve. We have mechanical engineers, structural engineers, lighting engineers, electrical engineers, PLC engineers, process engineers, system engineers, industrial engineers that are all working to reduce capital costs, reduce operating costs, improve quality. We have plant biologists, physiologists, pathologists, molecular biologists, microbiologists that are all working to understand the plants. We have teams in food safety, construction. We have also journeymen who are plumbers, electricians. It really takes a whole community, and it's a hard business because we have all this complex vertical integration. We also work with a bunch of partners to solve very real problems in a category of food where in leafy greens, there's more issues of food contamination than any other category. 11% of all food contamination is leafy greens, and which means that the approach to business here has to be with a priority of safety, people safety, food safety, and that interacts with design, it interacts with sanitation, and with the romanticized notion of feed the planet and attack these big problems, sometimes people are too fast with these very important details to reduce risk from a people safety, food safety standpoint. And the details matter. And unfortunately, there's going to be some black eyes in the industry, which doesn't mean the industry won't succeed. It will. So what I envision happening is, as you're seeing now, a whole lot of people enter the industry, a whole lot of failures, and then several successes and more successes come up. And it's not necessarily an industry where you have one success and everyone else fails, like a Facebook, where there's a networking effect. There could be a number of successes. And again, that could be good for competition in terms of the pressure of ever increasing standards of performance. Coupled with that, you have mayors, you have political leaders that see what vertical farming can do in terms of local food protection, local food security, and encouraging local food production, whether it's local farms, community farms, et cetera, et cetera. And I just encourage people to really think carefully about the food safety issues and what sort of risk they're putting in our food system. And some of the clumsy interactions are, for example, FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. USDA raises the levels of performance, which is good. What we want is policyholders to raise levels of performance, and at the same time saying if you're a small farm under a certain size, you don't have to adhere to certain standards. And as customers, we just feel like we're protected. But if all of a sudden the small farms, and I've built big farms, I've built small farms, we at AeroFarms, if the small farms aren't putting the thoughtfulness into adhering to food safety standards, then well-intentioned, but not appreciating the consequences of maybe allowing some classes of farms not to adhere to these standards, we are, from a policy perspective, putting all this food into our food system. So what we see is people want the spirit and the romanticized notion of local food production, but not appreciating the trade-offs by allowing a category of small farmers to get around food safety modernization standards, as well as appreciating that going fast doesn't necessarily mean going smart. And we could kind of go fast, but we really have to make, as an industry, calculated risks and put the thoughtfulness into process, procedure, certainly when it comes to sanitation and food safety.
And we have to add resilience. I mean, and I'd like to address that as well. One of the things that we see here in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and we see it really every time one of these major storms comes across a region, is the vulnerability of exterior food production of any kind, whether it's rooftop or urban lots or any kind of land-based exterior farming or food production. But when a storm comes across, it just wipes them out. So the beauty of interior, indoor, large-scale farming is not just the amount of food that you'll be able to supply, that you are able to supply, but also the protection from weather, from extreme weather events. So how do you see that moving forward, especially in terms of protecting your facilities, making sure you're not flooded, making sure you don't have windows that get blown out or roofs that get blown out? So it's about indoor food being the resilient solution, but also the indoor food providers like yourselves have to be resilient to these weather events also.
So resilience is a big part of the value proposition of
yes,
fully controlled agriculture or vertical farming. We could build a farm on the equator, we could build it in the North Pole. And so fully controlled agriculture, we could produce 365 days a year. And we also, like at AeroFarms, we actually have 23, 24 harvests a year. So it used to be 22, and now we could grow a plant faster, so we have more harvests a year.
How many do you have right now?
Excuse me?
How many?
20, now it's about 23, 24 harvests a year on average.
Great.
And so meaning we grow a plant in a very short amount of time, under 16 days from seed to harvest. Part of what we, from a resilience standpoint, if there is an issue, a huge storm that knocks out power or something of that nature, and there are lots of things we do to reduce risk of business interruption, but if there is, with 23 harvests a year, if all of a sudden we have to scrap a harvest, from an economic standpoint, if we lose one of 23 harvests a year, that's easier to manage financially than if you're in the field and you have 3 harvests a year and you lose one. That's painful. That's a third of your revenue. In a business with already low margins, that could be catastrophic. So here it enables us to, no pun intended, to weather the storm if and when that does happen, that big storm happens. Now,
you mentioned earlier the potential that you have or that the industry has for adding food types. You mentioned grains and others and beans, and how do you see that going forward as well? Going from leafy greens to really supplying a fuller plate of alternatives to the consumer, so that you are able to replace additional categories going forward And that also would make then our entire food chain a lot more resilient to climate change or to extreme weather events. So right now, we just have great leafy greens protected from extreme weather, but not necessarily, the grain products or the bean products or the other protein products or maybe some root vegetables or tree fruits and whatnot. How do you envision vertical farming taking on or diversifying as you move on?
Yeah, and so we believe from a technology standpoint, we could grow anything. Just how do you understand what a plant wants from spectrum to nutrients to CO2, O2, all of that. It's just understanding it and replicating it, and we could replicate it indoors like we could outdoors. That doesn't mean it makes economic sense. So we're like very business focused in the sense of what products should we go that make economic sense. So our main market is like leafy greens. And this is like a product that's sold to the customer, whether it's Fresh Direct, which is an online retailer, or ShopRite, Whole Foods, or supermarkets. And here, like we chose a name, Dream Greens, which is grown by AeroFarms. It's our brand, but it illustrates like one, what the messaging is to the customer. And then from a technology standpoint, enabling us to work with other potential partners to grow other fruits, vegetables that are where there's an economic reason to do so in the industry. So we have a whole team that's exploring other crops. I won't today tell you what crops we're prioritized growing and what's right in the pipeline. We're not ready to publicly announce that, but we are growing lots of other types of crops and always looking at what can be grown economically, and exploring from an R&D standpoint to a pilot standpoint and figuring out when it can be commercialized. Greens. By 2020, we will probably be launching our next very different category of food.
Okay, it's a couple of years. It's not that that's quick. That's great. All right, so let's get into policy now and cities and mayors and I mean, I would think that given the climate science and what it's telling us in terms of the urgency, we're looking at 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in as little as 10 years, maybe by next decade, certainly by the 2030s. And the time that it takes for an indoor farm to get up and running, and really to many indoor farms to feed an entire city population of, let's say, 1 million people, certainly more than that. So the urgency level in city halls around the world, you would think would be like off the charts, and they should be tripping over each other, offering you incentives and promoting and just bringing you over and showing you their city and helping you find the best possible real estate to put your farm in and what cities have traditionally done with industry and with all kinds of industrial promotion and site selection and that kind of thing. But that's not happening yet in indoor farming. It's nowhere near. I mean, so but in your contact with city managers, with mayors, whether through the 100RC program or not, what are you seeing and what are they telling you?
Yeah, we get a lot of interest. We have a business development team that focuses on where to build farms next at AeroFarms, and sometimes the incentives are there. And the incentives, I think this is a good place. As a member, personally, as a member of the B20 that advises the G20, the G20 is the world's largest countries with judged on their economies by GDP. The B20 advises the G20 on priorities and potential policies that advance industry, commerce, innovation. And I can share, I think this is a great place for our public-private partnerships, in so much as the public sector can put the incentives to drive innovation, food security, environmental considerations, and so forth. Often the incentives are very simple. They're around job creation, and that could be meaningful. This is about local manufacturing of sorts, local food production, and there's when you're talking about local, the economies of scale aren't there versus like one centralized manufacturing process. So net, I think this vertical farming is a job creator. Right now, talking U.S. specific, U.S. Department of Agriculture does have incentives for farmers, most of which do not work, more because it's a kind of blue state, red state thing. The policy was written in it with a lens towards helping the rural communities versus urban communities. And with the trends in urbanization, when the policies were written, they weren't written with the notion of vertical farming. People didn't realize this is an industry. So from a policy perspective, a legislative perspective, there needs to be a change as it relates to USDA to open up some of these incentives from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to enable vertical farming to go forward. That will hopefully be in parts of the ag bill coming up, but we'll see. But the point is, this is ways where cities could incentivize local food production, vertical farming. And here I would just encourage that the right companies have the right lens and aren't going too aggressively big before they've proven out how they address elements around food security, food safety, sanitation, reducing risk of food contamination. Then I say that just having seen a bunch of competitors, of people in the industry come to AeroFarms to buy them, having a chance to look at them and realizing there's a lot of risk in their systems that they weren't even aware of. Probably bi-weekly, we have other cities reaching out to us to build farms in their cities.
Okay.
They don't necessarily know, just because they say, hey, please build a farm in our city, doesn't mean they know how to incentivize that. So when we look at how we stack rank priority, what city to go into, part of it could be looking at what the business model is, what's the economics. Part of that is, are there incentives that help? If the economics aren't as strong in one geography versus the other, do incentives sort of equalize that? And again, I think this is a good place for public-private partnerships to put the incentives. Yes. And there are agencies like Resilient Cities, the Rockefeller Foundation, 100 Resilient Cities program, that educates cities about resiliency, and part of that is food resiliency, food security. And we're proud, AeroFarms, to be a platform partner of 100 Resilient Cities. And what we often do is like educate cities of, here are the considerations. If you want local food production, here are the considerations to see if this is meaningful for you, and here are the considerations of how to accelerate it. And that's something we're happy to engage cities and share our thoughts on how to accelerate local food production, how to accelerate vertical farming, where this could add value, and also looking at other forms of food production, what considerations to have.
Okay, so from a city perspective, it's nascent, it's early stage, early process. There is a learning curve. There is a process that will take us from here to that point where cities are really scaling this or looking to scale it. And you'll be a big part of that for sure. And I thank you very much for the time.
Thanks so much, Alex. Great to be with you.
Okay.